everybody, and welcome to Find My Past from Home. We are, as always, just delighted to have you with us. My name is Jen Baldwin. I am the Data Acquisition Manager for North America for Find My Past and the lead for the Global Ambassador Program, the Friends of Find My Past. And I am thrilled today to be joined by those friends. Welcome, everybody.
Hi, Jen.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
So we're going to start today. We're going to talk and focus on Anzac Day and the memorial around that event annually. But we're going to start by introducing the Friends of Find My Past, which is a relatively new program to Find My Past. And we're very excited to be welcoming these fine ladies from the Australia and New Zealand area of the world. So I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves very quickly for just a second. The Friends of Find My Past is an ambassador program. It's essentially influencer marketing. So we're taking advantage of years of genealogical experience and expertise and helping to uncover stories that are available through the record collection on Find My Past. So ladies, if we could just have you all introduce yourselves really quickly, and we'll start. Let's start with Cathie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cathie Sherwood from Ancestor Discovery. I've been researching my family for around 40 years and love nothing better than to help people break down their brick walls. My background is in education and IT, and I try and use those skills in helping others with their family history research.
Fabulous. Thanks, Cathie. And how about Maggie?
Kia ora, my name is Maggie Gaffney. I'm based in Wellington, New Zealand, and I've been researching my family since my teens on and off. My family is mostly Irish background with a bit of English and Scottish thrown into the mix. And my earliest ancestors arrived in New Zealand in 1857 from England. I'm involved with the local Irish and Scottish interest groups here in Wellington, and I'm also quite fascinated by the use of DNA in combination with paper research to sort of push your family history research further. And this year I'm doing the diploma in genealogy with the IHGS in Canterbury, Kent. So I'm kept fairly busy with that. That's me.
Excellent. Thank you. Helen.
Hi, I'm Helen Smith, Dragon Genealogy. I've been researching since 1986. My father is English. My mother is fifth generation Australian. So I've got stuff on all sides of the world. Being a public health microbiologist and molecular epidemiologist, DNA has been a very, very strong interest of mine. I've done a lot of work with DNA. I just love breaking down brick walls. Being a scientist, I love investigation. So family history and genealogical research is a perfect mix.
Thank you, Helen. Let's go to Teresa.
Good morning. I'm Teresa Lynch from Your Family Genealogist. Although Melbourne is my hometown, I live in Canberra, where I have easy access to all the National Institutions records, which is really convenient being a genealogist. I've always been interested in family history, and I was fortunate to live with my grandparents when I was growing up. So I grew up hearing all those family stories, and I used to love listening to them over and over again. I've been delving into my own family's history seriously now for about 10 years. When I retired from the public service, I did the Diploma of Family History program at the University of Tasmania. Then a little over 3 years ago, I decided to start my own business called Your Family Genealogist. And military family history is one of my particular areas of interest, together with convicts and also Irish and English family history research.
Fabulous. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Vanessa.
Hi, I'm Vanessa, and I run the YouTube channel Kindred Genealogy. I make videos about genealogy and history, and sometimes I go out and about and do little vlogs and things like that too. I find that most people love the videos about DNA. That seems to be the big thing these days. I really enjoy that too. I also just do a bit of research work here and there. I have a website, kindredgenealogy.family. My background's in history, and I've also done genealogy for about 15 years now. That's it.
So I lost track, but a combined expertise of somewhere's over like 120, 150 years between the 5 of you. Also participating in the program is Lorraine Newland, who runs Remembering the Past Australia Facebook group and website. So if you're unfamiliar with Lorraine's work, please do check out her site as well, because it's absolutely brilliant work. So these are the friends of Findmypast. And we're really, really excited to have you all with us in this program and to be introducing you today. So with that in mind, let's move on to the real topic of the day, which of course is Anzac Day. This started in Australia and New Zealand all the way back in 1916 to honor the 8,000 lives that were lost in the first year of Australia-New Zealand activity during World War I. Some of those key events, that first battle really dragged out for 8 months. Does anybody want to pick up on the historical context of Anzac Day?
Go on, Helen.
Anzac Day is probably really the first time that Australia and New Zealand combined overseas as individual nations rather than just it's because the Boer War was the previous one. So in many ways it was considered the birth of the two nations as nations separate together, actually actively working. The Anzac campaign, of course, is not just Australia and New Zealand. You, of course, had all your British and your other troops further up the peninsula. But for us particularly, it was almost a coming of age in the world's eyes, even though, of course, we already knew we were nations prior to this. So this is one of the really strong things where we took a massive part. We won't go into the politics of whether it's right or wrong, and certainly some bad military decisions were made, but huge amounts of effort and the countries getting behind our men over there and the traumas involved.
Yeah. Anzac actually stands for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. And as Helen said, it was the first time the two countries came together to work and fight as a team. A lot of people, usually non-Australians, find it, and non-Kiwis, find it odd that we celebrate Anzac Day because it was a battle that we lost, a long, drawn-out battle, as Jen said, that we actually lost. But it's not a day we celebrate. It's a day of commemoration, where we commemorate those people who gave their life, went off to fight for their country and gave their lives, in such huge numbers. And that's something that I think we really value here, that we commemorate those people, not celebrate Anzac Day.
I also was reading through some of the history on the day. Not being Australian or from New Zealand, I am a little bit unfamiliar with Anzac Day. But it wasn't really declared a full public holiday, I understand, until 1922. The government agreed it was a national day of commemoration in 1920, but it was 1922 and then 1927 before all the states observed the day.
Yeah.
So the impetus for the day, it had been, South Australia was actually the first state to have a remembrance for Anzac Day, and that was actually in the September of the same year, 1915. They had that on their Wattle Day. So, and then Melbourne did a commemoration as well in December of 1915, but it wasn't until January 1916 that it became more formalised, and that was here in Queensland. So the Premier of Queensland at the time, Thomas Ryan, actually chaired a committee that was about establishing a day to commemorate Anzac Day. And one of the key people on that committee was a cleric called David Garland, and it was his ideas about all of the features around Anzac Day that we really have essentially today. He was the one who talked about the dawn service, the commemoration part of it, that it would be celebrated as a day solely without other distractions like shops opening, races, all that kind of stuff. So, and then that proposal was sent by the chair to to the Commonwealth and as a proposal that this be something that be established Australia-wide. So that's how Anzac Day actually started. So the first formal one was in Anzac Day 1916.
And then, of course, you have World War II that also gets incorporated into the commemoration. And so now today, it's recognized as a day of memorial and a day of commemoration for all lives lost in military conflicts across Australia and New Zealand. So it's a very significant event. And I think as genealogists, right, many of us find that, of course, we have ancestors who served in wars, in military service, in other roles, supporting war efforts around the world. Do you all have stories that you would share about your families or what Anzac Day means to you?
Mm-hmm.
I think Anzac Day for me has changed over the years. I mean, when I was a teenager, I was in the training corps, and so there were several years where I was actually parading on the day. And when we did history in school, I remember doing the origins of World War One, and there was actually very little about Australia and New Zealand's involvement. It was all how it all started, and it was very much it seemed like a very European conflict. And but since then, since I've actually researched some ancestors and relatives' involvement, suddenly then it becomes more personal, and then you think, oh, okay, so what happened then, and what was going on, and you also understand more of the impact to obviously people that died or were injured, but to the families and the communities that people who survived went back to, or the people who had lost, men and women over there, and so it becomes quite different from this kind of what was like a noble conflict. It becomes more personal, and then you can link it into sort of more recent events and all military conflict, rather than just this one war that happened a long, long time ago. You've got an in to that kind of the personal stories, I think, so it means a lot more to me than it did growing up.
Mm-hmm. It's always meant a lot to me because my family has a long history of military service dating back to the Boer War, and we've had family member in every major war and conflict since, right up to Afghanistan most recently. Back in World War I, my grandfather lied about his age when he was only 15 and somehow managed to enlist in the army until his father found him 3 weeks later in the training camp and dragged him back to the country, to home. He eventually staged his papers when he was 18, and so he managed to get off to war later than what he originally had anticipated. One of my great uncles sailed for the first convoy from Australia with the Kiwis off to World War I, and one of his letters is a wonderful description of the HMAS Sydney actually leaving their convoy escort and chasing after the German cruiser Emden, which they ran aground and destroyed. And that was, they barely left the Australian coastline when that happened. But it's a wonderful story and letter that we treasure, from that time. We also lost a great uncle on the first day at the Battle of Fromelles, where more than 5,000 Australian soldiers were either killed, wounded, or captured that day. And what was a dreadful decision by the senior officers to make them go over the top when they had a German enfilade of machine gun coming at them from both directions. And they didn't stand a chance. It really never should have happened. It was, I think, one of the greatest losses in a single day in Australia's history of wartime activities. So it's always been important to us and to our family and to me in particular. And I love the fact that these days it's become almost a pilgrimage for a lot of Australian and New Zealand young people to actually go to Gallipoli on Anzac Day and be there for the dawn service. They stay outside overnight. There's no hotels or anything there, and it's very cold this time of year in Turkey. But it's a wonderful thing, I think, to continue the memories and the importance of Anzac Day to our two countries and what it means to us, and how it's had an impact on the development of the legend of the Anzacs in Australia and New Zealand.
It's about commemoration, but I also think it's about loss. Yeah. So my uncle was killed in 1916, similar to what Therese was talking about. He was on the Somme, and he was out collecting ammunition, and a mule kicked a bomb which exploded, killing him and numerous other young men. And the story in the war diary is quite abrupt about this episode, but it's also quite poignant. And I have the story of what happened when my grandparents, because it was reported in the local paper, of when my grandparents were actually informed about this loss of my uncle, William, who was, I must add, only 19. So he lied to get in. He was just short, a couple of months shy of his 18th birthday before he went in. And then my father had another first cousin who was also killed in the First World War as well, but up at Ypres rather than in 1917. My dad served, and he was in the RAAF as an aircraft mechanic, and he served in New Guinea and Borneo. But I also I talked about loss. I know about my grandparents' loss. I know how hard it must have been for them. But my father wrote letters to my mother nearly every day. So I have something like 350 letters that Mum kept, and that I have. And you can see coming through all of these letters all the time is the loss he feels of family. And it must have been terribly hard for my mother. She had 3 children. Yes, she had her parents close by, so she had support. But I think that's the sadness of it all. So it's remembering, it's honouring sacrifice, but it's about loss too.
I think every one of my ancestors who went to the First World War didn't come back, or not direct ancestors. Most of them were offshoots, like great uncles or cousins and things. One of them was from one family, 3 brothers. All of them didn't come back. One of them was the first sort of son, and he was engaged, and they gave him a big send-off party. There was a really great article on Trove of the send-off party that the town threw before he went, and then he didn't come back. And they printed one of his letters that he'd written back as well. It was a really good letter. It was just, it was really sad. I think he got sick. The other ones died in explosions and things like that. Both of my grandfathers were in World War II. One of my grandfathers is American, so he was with the American Army, but one is Australian. However, I had so much trouble finding his record, and it turned out that he'd signed up with the British Imperial Army. I have no idea why he did that, but he was still here, so it's confusing. But he was in Japan and the Kokoda track as well. We ended up donating a bunch of the photos that he took to the War Memorial, just because he had albums of them that he'd taken and figured that they'd be good there. But he never talked about it, so I never heard any first-hand stories. He didn't want to talk about it. He didn't ever go to the marches Anzac Day. He just didn't want to ever think about it. So
I think my father was similar to Vanessa, that he did go to the marches. I can remember as a child him getting up very early to go to the dawn. We lived on a farm, so he would get up to go to the nearest little town to go to the dawn service, but he didn't like to talk about it. And it wasn't until he got older that he would start mentioning things. And like you mentioned, he has. I still have his photos that he took when he was in Borneo, when the Japanese surrendered. So he has photos of the Japanese commander there and all of those kinds of things of his time, particularly in Borneo, not so much when he was in New Guinea and the Philippines.
Yeah, because I've got English, I've got people on both sides. Both my parents. So I lost my dad's father in World War II. We lost 11 people in World War I. Luckily, we had quite a number come back. So my father served, my grandfather served, my great-grandfather served, and my great-great-grandfather served in direct lines, which makes quite an interesting history for military service. There was quite a lot lost. Of course, one of the really strong things is getting the true story of what was happening to the people. I've got a number of them who served, who would write letters home, which is great. But of course, what they wrote home to their brothers to what they wrote home to their mothers was very, very different. And that's something that's really important to remember, is the history we can find as to the context and the impact on the people who served and when they came home. I'll talk a little bit more about Ernest William Weeks in a bit, because he's really quite impactful in what happened to him away and when he came home, and the potential aspect of that, which may or may not be true. It's just one of those really big problems that, and I think this is one of the really good things about the commemoration for Anzac Day, is how it's changed. Many, many years ago, the story of the Anzac was a very one-dimensional story, whereas now it's definitely changed, and there's a lot more of the impacts behind and the social impact on the people who went, the people who stayed, not necessarily 100% just going down the government's path on certain things. So I think we have a much better commemoration now, taking into account all of those things in comparison to that very one-dimensional that it was probably back 30, 40, 50 years ago in comparison to now.
Yes, my Uncle Jack had what probably you would call a good World War One. You know, he started off as a sapper with a light horse, and he went up through the ranks and finished an officer. And he came back. You know, he went off with the first convoy and came back, one of the first people back, because it was first out, first home after the war. And he got a job straight away, unlike so many people that came back from the war who were unemployed. Many of them, you know, were badly damaged, both mentally and physically, and they didn't get very much help at all from the government. My great Uncle Jack, actually, in disgust, went down to the local river and threw his medals in the river because he was so upset and so angry at the way the government treated or, you know, provided so little support and help to some of those broken people that came back from the war, of whom there were really many. It wasn't all glory going over there and fighting the war, that's for sure. Quite the opposite, you know, in many ways. And the deprivations of war, you know, were pretty terrible. Uncle Jack spent his war in the Middle East. He didn't go to France after Gallipoli, but they had to contend with malaria, you know, constant shortages of water for them and their horses. It was a very, very difficult time. And there's all sorts of other diseases as well as, you know, malaria, but malaria is what seems to talk to them about the most in the Middle East. Excuse me.
Some really powerful stories from all of you. Thank you for sharing. I'm sitting here quietly thinking about my own ancestors who served during this time, but I don't know that any of them were involved in something quite as severe as Gallipoli and some of the other battles. I don't know. It's just a different dichotomy, I guess, different experience. Very, very powerful stories. So thank you for that. I'm wondering, I know that there are many war memorials across the two countries. What kind of impact do you think that those memorials have made over the history of your locations, but also what kind of impact can they make in the future?
I think nearly every small town in Australia has a war memorial that was built by public subscriptions by the local people. And every Anzac Day and Remembrance Day in November, they are the focus of commemorations generally, whether it be a dawn service or a service later in the day. They really have become the focus. The major cities in Australia have, you know, large memorials. There's the Shrine in Melbourne. Where I live here in Canberra, there's the Australian War Memorial, which is a wonderful edifice, and we never call it museum. It's quite a contentious thing, but it is a wonderful memorial, and it's award-winning, and it's also Australia's most visited attraction by all accounts. But it's important to remember it's not a museum, it's not a tourist attraction. It is a memorial, and I think it's treated like that. They have a big dawn service every Anzac Day, where nearly half of Canberra generally turns out in the cold. It's usually very cold this time of year in the early morning Canberra. And I think going forward, they will continue to serve a tremendous purpose to focus people on remembering and commemorating all of those Australians and New Zealanders who went off and served their country, either in the World War I or in the later conflicts where we seem to be involved so regularly.
Yeah, it's the local, it's the local memorials that have been erected by subscription by local communities, as Teresa's saying, because there wasn't funding for those. There wasn't government funding for those, so it was. And you can look at the newspapers during the late 1910s and the early 1920s, where there's a subscription fund. There's people trying to get money to have these memorials. And I was involved very late in the piece in a community project that took 5 local community memorials in Wellington and researched the 96 men that were listed as being killed during World War I. And this was part of the centenary commemorations of the war. And instead of just being these names that mean nothing on these memorials, they became people, and the local schools got involved as well. And it was, we found photographs of people. They lived down the road from us, and it suddenly makes it more personal. And so by sharing those stories as well, that means that the community, more and more people are turning up to these local memorials, and they're looked after. And the national ones are important. But I think it's remembering the people within the local community as well that gave their lives and suffered.
And it's not just this big memorial. So every town has one, but it's also your local church, your local school. Most businesses had at least a plaque in their business premise of the ones who went. And it wasn't just the ones who were killed. Generally, it was the ones who served, remembering all of them. And sadly, a number of those business ones and church and school ones have gotten lost. The railways all had one because as they renovate buildings and things, they get put away for safekeeping and may not come back. But all of those were horrendously important too. And there's lots of work, particularly with the commemoration for the 100-year commemoration of the close of World War I, where lots of people have actually been trying to get some information on where they are. And all of those things are hugely important.
It wasn't just memorials, though. People remembered in other ways. I've just read a story about the number of people who named their newborn children Anzac, Dardanelles or Dardanella or Gallipoli. And in fact, Maggie, you might be interested to know that there's at least one Kiwi who uses the name Anzac it's been down 4 generations now.
Oh.
So his great-grandfather, his grandfather himself, all have the first name Anzac, and he has named his son, I can't remember the first name, but his second name, his middle name is Anzac. So apparently in about 1916, which was the peak of the names, there was something like 200, 300 registrations across Australia of people using those kinds of names to remember for whatever reason, whether it was just commemorating a loved one or just for the honouring the service of people.
Any other? I'm letting you guys sit for a minute and see everybody gets a chance to talk if you want.
There are a couple of bigger memorials in Sydney as well. I'm going to head in and visit them over the next week or so. There's in Martin Place, there's the statue, I forget what it's called, the soldier. And there's also one in Hyde Park, a big one that you can go inside. It's not near what the one in Canberra is like, but it's still pretty beautiful. And they've just renovated it and done some new stuff to it. So it'll be interesting to see what it's like. But I think also, like what people were saying, it's the personal stories behind it. So you've got the memorial and you've got the names on it, but when you have those people's actual stories or just know a little bit about them, a face behind the name, that's, I think, what gets people more in tune with the whole thing. I think that's important.
Yeah.
I looked up one of my, one of my ancestors, my great uncle who died in Changi, the prisoner of war camp, and his when I looked him up on the nominal roll in the War Memorials website, they actually project the individual names onto the exterior of the building, like one by one. So when I looked him up, for example, it gave the sort of date and time that his name would be projected if I wanted to go and see that. I thought that was a really nice idea.
Yeah, it is. Originally, that was only supposed to be a 100th anniversary activity, for over period of a few months, but they've continued it now. It's permanent. It's become permanent, and you drive past there at night and you see the names lit up. It's just tremendous. I really, really like that. It doesn't cost any additional money. It's just become a really valued part of what the memorial does now, which I really appreciate personally.
Yeah, so I said I was going to talk about Ernest William Weeks. So Ernest William Weeks is my great uncle who was at Gallipoli, went to Egypt and came back. Couple of weeks after he came back to Brisbane, he was on the way to visit his lady who had held on for 5 years for him, and he never made it there. So about 2 weeks after that, his body was pulled from the Brisbane River. At the time, people thought it was suicide. Family never thought that because he had a job to go back to. He had a girlfriend though, and there had talk of them getting married, etc. But it is hard to actually know. Harold Peacock is a historian who's out Ipswich Way, who had done a little bit of work because Ernest was found in the Brisbane River, just off the Bremer River, and realised that Ernest actually wasn't discharged from the army until a month after he had died. So, but Ernest isn't listed at the Australian War Memorial on the Roll of Honour. You could get listed on that Roll of Honour if you were serving in the military when you died, or died as a consequence of serving in the military up to early 1920. So Harold submitted Ernest's name with the information to the Australian War Memorial, and it went through the committee there and was announced a couple of weeks ago that he has now been added to the honour roll of the Australian War Memorial, and his first rejection will be in August.
That's great.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that's really good news.
Sadly, they have written suicide, which I still disagree with because I don't think it was. He had his army greatcoat on, so whether perhaps he just was walking along the river and slipped, because I don't think he'd have survived real well. It was really hard getting out. He was in full military uniform, woolen uniform. So family didn't think there was any reason. So the family never thought it was suicide, but he's listed as committing suicide on the honour roll.
Yeah. Back in 1922, there was a lot of discussion about whether we should bring one of the unknown soldiers home to Australia. But it took until 1993 before that finally happened. They brought back one of the unknown soldiers from northern France, from Flanders, and he's now lying in the Hall of Memory at the Australian War Memorial, which I love that. It's so well done. And you go in there and you think, well, it could be my Uncle George that's in there, or it could be anybody's family who was never found. When Uncle George was killed at the Battle of Fromelles, his body was never recovered, and so I like to think that there's a slim possibility that that's him lying there in state, in a wonderful tomb there, where everybody can go and pay their respects.
Yeah, unlike the US, who do bring their service people home, Australia and New Zealand don't. So, yeah.
It has been quite moving. I researched the cousin of my great-grandfather who served and died and in France, and so where he's buried, and going and visiting that. And because then you get kind of caught up in his part, I suppose, because you are journeying. But it always made me really sad. I mean, I think it always hits me hard is the people that went who don't have any descendants. Who don't have anybody to go and visit their grave. And his brother was also fighting in France. Did he ever go to his brother's grave? Is what who has been there to visit? And it's so it was really special to go there. And I hope that since then other family have gone as well, because I told them where it was. Said, you've got to go. But there must be so many that are never visited by family or.
That's a good segue, actually, Maggie, into something else I wanted to touch on with all of you. And I'm curious, as your experience as family historians increases, as you continue to research the lives of your individual ancestors, have your traditions around Anzac Day changed, or have you added anything or do something different than your parents did, or you did when you were growing up, or something that you would like to do, perhaps?
I don't think so. Because my grandmother's brother died and it broke her so much. I think even just growing up, I knew how sort of awful it was. And even as a kid, I felt like very sad about the whole thing. And I don't think it's really changed for me. I feel like I always felt like it was a very sad time of year, but
Last year, because of COVID, it was a very different Anzac Day. There are so few Anzac Day activities because of the restrictions. But one thing that I loved last year was there was a big push for people to go to the end of their driveway or go out on the balcony of their apartment at dawn and commemorate. And so we did that, as did most of the neighbours in our street, which was ended up being a wonderful community activity, which we're going to actually do again this year. I'm only walking distance from the War Memorial, so I could easily go to up there for the dawn service, but I choose not to now. I just like this more community feel in the street, and and friends. Some friends came over last year, and we just had the dawn service on the computer, on the laptop, and the last post, and we just stood out there with candles, as I said, as did many others. And I would like to see that continue going forward, as an Australian thing to do, particularly if people can't get to the Anzac Day marches and that sort of thing, which I certainly did as growing up. You had to go to the Anzac Day march every year. That was a given. That's what you did on Anzac Day in Melbourne when I was a kid. I sort of didn't continue it as a teenager or as a young adult, but I've come back to it in spades now that I'm a genealogist, and I value it more than I ever did. So I think there's some things we can do differently going to the future.
Yeah, when I was living in England, when my kids were younger, we used to, they were involved in Scouts and Cubs, so we'd go along on Remembrance Day, and I'd always have a little cross with, a couple of relatives that we were remembering. And in 2015, when they had there was a service at Westminster Abbey, so I took my children, go through all the security rigmarole to get in, and took them to the service. And they're less inclined now to get up early, and we've got a little memorial near us. So not last year, but previous years we've gone up. Possibly not at dawn, but other times during the day. So that's been really nice.
I always think about two up on Anzac Day. My father always tells the story, and I don't know how true this is, that he used to run the two-up schools when he was travelling, because he was considered the sober, reliable one. So all the men would trust him to hold the money and do all the things for two-up when they were playing that. So he always tells the story, as I said, that he used his two-up earnings to put as a deposit on his first sugarcane farm. So whether that's true or not, one doesn't know. So I have a two-up collector's item from Anzac Day that was actually given to me. But in terms of me doing anything different, I don't go to the parades and I don't necessarily do the memorials, but I always make sure that Anzac Day, I write a blog post, I put something on Facebook. I always remember it that way about those people who served.
I try and listen to the service for the service that's held on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and we have to give massive credit to the Turks. Basically, we invaded their country, and they've maintained the peninsula. They've maintained the graves there. They allow us to invade again every year and treat us very hospitably while they do so. And I think it gives an indication of the cooperation we can have because of that. So I always try and listen to that service, perhaps more so than any of the others. because it gives me a hope for the future that we can all kind of work together, and then take the time to remember my people.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, I thought I'd mention, talking about like virtual things or what people are doing now. There's a website, it's lestweforget.gov.au, and you can leave like a virtual poppy or a message, or you can just read through the other messages. It's really nice.
Mm-hmm.
There's the Auckland War Museum have got an online cenotaph, so they have links to the digitised records, service records. But what's really lovely, and so if they find extra information, they'll put it in. But what's so lovely is that you can lay a poppy, and you can also submit personal stories and research that you've done. So it's a continuing kind of memorial, but also a fantastic educational resource. Lucky if you jump onto one and somebody's done some of the research for you. Or
Discovering Anzacs is the Australian one, which also has the New Zealand attestation forms as well, but it's got the archive side of it. But it also has the personal side where you can upload your photos, you can upload your stories relating to the person, you can upload information you found in the newspapers and that sort of thing. And there's lots of people been doing it. Apart from anything else, it may be the only place you can actually find a photograph of one of your ancestors or the side branches of your ancestral family, because you don't have a photograph in your family that someone else may have uploaded one for you. So it is a marvellous way of actually doing things and remembering.
I didn't quite catch the name of that one, Helen.
Discovering Anzacs.
Thank you. I'm trying to get them up on the screen for everybody, if I'm quick enough.
Yeah, so it's got the Australian attestation forms, and they've now digitised the repatriation forms for the ones who went through the repatriation service when they get back. It's also got some nurses, it's got some ammunition workers, but it's also got the personal stories and the things that people can upload. And I'm not 100% certain, but currently the Australian government is in the process of digitising the World War II attestation forms. I don't know whether that's going to go on that site or not, but it's a marvellous way of doing it. And I was very thrilled when the New Zealand attestation records went up there as well, because it's discovering Anzacs. They should be there.
Yeah. And a great segue into maybe perhaps our last discussion point, because believe it or not, we're almost already at an hour together. What suggestions would you have in terms of resources and family history research for those who want to discover the stories of their of soldiers and others who served in the Australian New Zealand military?
National Archives.
Yeah.
NAA.gov.au, I think it is.
Yeah. For World War I, the Discovering Anzac sites is a good place to start, because on the Australian side, that is records that are held at the National Archives, because it's a National Archives site. So it's a really good place to start. And remembering, of course, Australians enlisted in New Zealand and New Zealanders listed in Australia. Plus, you had a large number of English people who were born in England who enlisted, of course, in Australia or in New Zealand, because, of course, that was where predominant numbers of our people came from. So that's particularly important. Have a look in your home, because, of course, lots of people have either military, the medals perhaps, or they may have discharge papers, discharge certificates, or other ephemera. Interestingly enough, lots of soldiers brought back things like 22 bullets and 382 bullets and 383 bullets and all that sort of good stuff. Hopefully not live anymore, but you'll find lots of that sort of ephemera in your home. Trove, of course, is massively important, because it's the Australian digitised newspapers. And, of course, in New Zealand, you've got Papers Past. So that's a good way of putting your name in if you're not sure whether you've got people who've been in the military or not. So they're good places to start.
Yeah, if you're looking for New Zealanders, I'd look at Archives New Zealand, archives.gov.nz. I've got a great research guide on researching your military ancestors, and their online catalogue, which is Archway, so archway.archives.gov.nz, I think, have got if you put in a surname, and if it's a common surname, put it in the first name. But they have digitized and linked all the records for all the attestation forms, service records for all World War I military personnel. And then again, the online cenotaph will also link to those, and some of the embarkation rolls as well. And I'd also look at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website, because you can filter by country and by war. So if you're looking, depending on whether you're looking for World War I or World War II, and they will list people that came back, but they're commemorated. They may have died like in the 50s or 60s, but they're still regarded as a Commonwealth war grave. And that will often link to further information as well, and next of kin, and where the next of kin were living. So that can be really useful when you're researching.
Yeah.
So 2 sets of records that I found really helpful, that the Australian War Memorial have digitised and have on their side, is the war diaries. You need to know what unit your person served, but if you know that, you can track them. You can follow where they went, battles they fought, and what happened, which is how I found out about my Uncle William. The other thing I found really wonderful was the Red Cross letters and applications that are on the War Memorial site as well, because I found in there a letter written by somebody who had known a great uncle in India and realised that William was his nephew, and wrote a story about what she knew and asked questions about this great uncle in India and my great grandfather, who was a captain in the Royal Engineers in India. So that little meshing of that family history about a man, my uncle, dying in France, going all the way through India, to me was just quite astounding. So they were fabulous records.
Yeah. The War Memorial, Australian War Memorial, is my favourite as well. Most people, I think, if they're researching military ancestors, tend to find their way to the National Archives and the service record, and you can get a lot of information out of that. But there's more information to be had at the War Memorial. For example, they have the embarkation rolls and the nominal rolls. They've got a fantastic photographic collection, with as many as they've ever been able to find, of World War I soldiers who inevitably had a photo taken either before they left to go overseas or while they were overseas and sent home to family. And I found a couple of photos there that I didn't have at all of some of my great uncles, which was really unexpected, and it was a great delight to find. They have photos of individuals as well as group photos. For example, I've got one of a great uncle who was there in the training camp at Broadmeadows in Victoria, in Melbourne, with several other people. There's this huge rows and rows of tents behind them. So that's a tremendous collection, which I always recommend people search for. I also love the Red Cross records, as Cathie said. I found a record there, which was an investigation into my great uncle George Roney's missing in action, into his death, and it described by his platoon commander what they went through and how they went over the top and how they didn't stand a chance and how they were out in no man's land and they couldn't retrieve the bodies. It was very short but very moving, and something that doesn't exist in the service records. There was a letter in the service record from my great uncle's father asking what actually happened to their son, and there's no evidence in the record, in the service record, that he ever got an answer. So I was really pleased to actually find it in the War Memorials collection there. The War Unit Diaries, as Cathie said, is another favourite, but so too for me is Bean's Official History of Australia in the Great War of 1914-1918. It's quite a mouthful, and it's a huge opus of something like 27 volumes, but it's all been digitised and online now at the War Memorial, and it's all neatly broken down into chapters about any topic that you can imagine. For example, if you had family in the Light Horse, it tells you all about the Light Horse and about the battles they went through. Again, one of my great uncles was nominated for the Military Cross for his activities on the road to Damascus, and that action was actually described in detail in the history. So you can find all sorts of additional contextual information there, and it's really well written. You know, it made me laugh, it made me cry, it made me angry, it made me proud. It takes you through the whole emotion, which I never expected, and it's not written for military types. It's written for ordinary people like you and me to read, and it's a fantastic work which most people have forgotten about, and it's not very fashionable these days, but I highly recommend that as a wonderful work of record to delve into an adult, depending on the areas of interest.
Something to also consider, the Australian War Memorial has got a research area. They've collected a lot of diaries and things, so there's a major research library there. But don't forget your state libraries and the National Library. Each of the state libraries in Australia have a local history collection where people have deposited their personal papers and all sorts of things. So particularly as from the result of the commemoration for World War I, there's been a lot of digitisation of those records. So the Queensland State Library and the John Oxley digitised things like diaries of doctors who were at Gallipoli and personal papers. They digitised the women of the Red Cross in Brisbane who were getting together and raising money and winding bandages and all that, so digitised their minutes and all of that sort of thing. They digitised the papers of a hospital in London that was run by women because the Australian Army didn't believe females should be doctors, so they wouldn't accept them. So these women went to London and they set up their own hospital. So there's some paperwork around that's been digitised. The National Library of Australia has got its newspapers trove, which of course we know and love, but they've also got journals. And so these are things that are published repeatedly, but not necessarily a newspaper. One of them is actually the newspaper published by the soldiers aboard the Ceramic going across to Gallipoli, where they did like a newsletter on board. And okay, it's 12 issues, but it was telling you what was happening there each day. So that was pretty cool. So you got lots of extra resources, which we've now seen available digitised because of the 100-year commemoration. So there's lots of extra ways you can add context and life to your ancestors with these extra things.
Yeah.
I would also just add actually international collections, international newspapers, because it was such a, both military conflicts obviously were such global events that they often reported on what other allied troops were doing. And international photo collections. Like, for example, I know at the Library of Congress, they have pretty astounding number of records of the British military. And I believe I've seen Australia and New Zealand there as well. So, take it a bit broader at times as well.
Yeah, so there's the National Archives in London have got unit war diaries from the New Zealand Expeditionary Forces, which is really handy, as well as the one, as well as the archives in Wellington, and also the Australian War Museum have got. If you drill down, it doesn't mention New Zealand, but if you drill down, eventually you'll get to some New Zealand unit ones. It's amazing little pockets you can find these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The London Gazette. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, there's also the New Zealand Electronic Tech Centre have digitised quite a few, regimental histories and things, so that you can actually find out about particular battles or engagements, skirmishes. And so they're kind of a bit, they're a little bit one-sided, but it does give you an idea of the timings of things, and then you can match it up with the war diaries, because they can be a little bit obtuse sometimes, and try and fit it all together. It's quite useful.
National Library of Scotland's digitised trench maps for World War I for France. So that can be a great way of actually plotting your people. The Findmypast historical newspaper archive, remembering people from our side of the world went across and were fighting over in Europe, but they often went back to see their families. So local papers often did make some mention, but sadly so many were wounded and so many hospitals were raised in England. So you often had mentions in the local papers about soldiers who were recovering in hospitals there, and remembering a number of them were recovering for months at a time. So you can get some extra context and history there.
Yeah, I also like the London Gazette, which is, I don't find it an easy website to navigate or to find things. But fortunately, Findmypast is digitised, or not digitised, has an index now to the London Gazette, and there's a lot of Australians and New Zealanders mentioned there in dispatches, and also if they were recommended for gallantry awards, they're also recorded in the London Gazette as well, even though they're Australian or they're Allied forces. So that's another useful one. And Findmypast has also got the Australian embarkation nominal rolls as well, as you can get them at the War Memorial. But if you're just searching through Findmypast, you'll often come across those also. I like the embarkation rolls in particular because it tells me how much they were paid and how much they remitted home from their pay every week. For example, the married men had to remit at least 67% to their families. The single people didn't have to do that. It's interesting to read, well, okay, Uncle Jack, how much did you send home to your family? And he did, I think, 80% to help his parents who weren't well off support their 11 children. So, there's all sorts of nice stories amongst those statistics or those sort of records.
Okay, very good. Any final thoughts on Anzac Day or the research perspective of it or anything really from the group?
Remembering remembering them is how we can actually still bring them to life and keep them alive. So talking about it in our families, getting the extra memory, and talking to any of our people who have served or people who've been through these situations of how military affected them, either by serving or by the ones left at home having to run. The poor wives having to raise families at home without their husbands present. And then also being very aware of any of our current serving people. It's very easy to send people off to fight in the wars, but we have to be able to look after them when they come home and give that extra support. So just being aware of the traumas they will go through and what we can actually do as individuals and countries to support our serving men and women, past, present and future.
And finding ways of sharing stories. I mean, it's wonderful to be able to, the kids are always doing a project or something like that at school, and you go, hang on just a second. Okay, here's a photograph or here's a newspaper story, and then I'll sit down and bore you for no. But you find a way of engaging them so that actually they're kind of real people, and then suddenly the history makes more sense and comes alive, and find ways of sharing, on social media or blogging or a photo book or something of the research that you do, so that the rest of your family can share in it and know the stories as well. I think is really important, so that people are not forgotten.
That's that bringing it all together, that you're talking about there.
Okay. Anything else we want to throw in before we call this one done? All
Happy
right.
researching.
Yeah, happy researching. Yeah. Thank you all very much for joining us for this very special Findmypast from Home. We're very pleased to have you all with us. So thank you very much for sharing your stories and letting us see a little bit of your research and your families. It's very appreciated. For those of you out in the world who are watching this and want to research your military ancestors, we do have a special page on the Findmypast website just for Anzac research. So if you navigate to findmypast.com.au/page/Anzac-ancestors, it's a mouthful, but you'll get there. We do have kind of all of our records set aside, so it's really easy to get started. If you have any questions for Findmypast, please feel free to leave them in the chat, or for any of these lovely ladies that have joined us today, excuse me. Please feel free to reach out to any of them on their websites, their blogs, their social media, or find them through the Findmypast channels. We're always happy to help you discover our friends. And last but not least, if you have a story that you would like to share about your Anzac experience, your ancestors, your family story, we are always happy to hear those as well. And you can send those to Findmypast at discoveries@findmypast.com. I think I've covered everything they want me to cover. So thank you very much, ladies, for joining me today. Again, I appreciate your time very much, your expertise and your generosity with your stories. And for all of you out there taking a moment to commemorate Anzac Day, we're with you. And I think that's a moment that's should be recognized kind of globally, to be honest. I will certainly take some time for myself on Anzac Day this year as well. So thank you all for joining us, and we will see you on the next Find My Past from Home.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you, Jen. Bye, everyone.